this video, we will briefly discuss reading strategically. And I want to talk about two subjects in particular. The first subject is identifying core concepts, and the second subject is analyzing arguments. This is going to apply to a philosophy class in particular, but it also could apply to other classes as well. So, in order to start looking at how to read strategically, let's look at our textbook, Living Ethics. So, in this textbook, we have a few things that are worth looking at first. I always recommend that you start with the table of contents and see, broadly speaking, what we're going to be studying in the class. So if you notice, this particular textbook is broken down into two main parts. There's part 1, moral theories, and part 2, moral problems. So the 11 chapters of the moral theory part, they are mostly specific chapters about specific theories. So skepticism about morality, the good life, consequentialism, Kantian ethics, social contract theory, natural law, the ethic of prima facie duties, virtue ethics, feminist ethics, and the ethics of care. These are specific moral theories, or you could say families of moral theories. And we have chapter 3 through 11, each dedicated to one of these theories. The chapter 1 and 2, these chapters serve a somewhat different function. So chapter 1, what is morality? That's very much an introductory chapter. That chapter is going to cover the groundwork, the core concepts that will be used for all the rest of these other chapters. In the second chapter, moral reasoning, that's another introductory chapter, but that chapter is more methodological. This moral reasoning chapter is going to try to teach you the method of how to reason properly. So, chapter 1 introduces the topic in the broadest possible strokes. Chapter 2 introduces the method in the broadest possible strokes. So, what are we going to say is the most important thing to read in this book? Probably chapters 1 and 2. Chapters 1 and 2 are going to be vital to read probably in full, and maybe even to reread, because you really want to internalize the core idea of the course so that you can apply it to the rest of the chapters. And you want to internalize the core methodology of the course so you can apply it to the rest of the chapters. So it's really important to have that technique of moral reasoning down before you start reading the other chapters, because you want to reason properly when you read those other chapters. And that moral reasoning is something we're going to be doing throughout the course. And actually, if there's one thing to take away from the entire course, besides for just having a respect and some enjoyment of the subject, a core thing to take away would be the ability to morally reason. So let's look at a chapter. So we'll go into the moral reasoning chapter because I've said it's so important. One of the things about philosophy is that I'd prefer if you not memorize. There are some things that you do have to memorize, but in the end, I would like it if you memorize as little as possible. But there are some things that you do really have to memorize, and that mainly is vocabulary. So I bring this up because here on the first page of this chapter, we have these bolded words, argument and premises. And if we scroll all the way to the end of the chapter, we're going to see that there is actually a little glossary that gives us all of the bolded words for the chapter. So if you're going to memorize something for this course, I would say to start here in these bolded glossaries. The main reason for this is not because memorization is good in itself, but because if you're going to speak the philosophical vocabulary, if you're going to have philosophical conversations, you need to do at least a little bit of memorization to just have those words on quick draw to use when you're in those conversations. There's really not very much way around that besides for memorization. But why am I being critical of memorization? Well, memorization is one methodology of thinking, right? You memorize, and that's a form of thinking. But another form of thinking is argumentation. And argumentation, or what we also are calling reasoning, is really what we want to practice in a philosophy class. I would love it if students didn't have to memorize any arguments' conclusions. I would love it if they could just arrive at conclusions via reasoning. And the main way to learn how to reason is to internalize the argument forms. So, modus ponens is probably our most important argument form. If P then Q, P therefore Q. Throughout the course, for every subject, we want to be able to spontaneously generate arguments like this. We want to say, okay, we're going to have one conclusion. Let's say our conclusion the conclusion that we're trying to argue for is that the best theory of morality is consequentialism. If that's what we want to argue for, then we want to be able to generate two premises that then validly conclude that consequentialism is the best theory of morality. So that's going to be something that takes practice to do because most courses require memorization. They require that you memorize names, dates, words, concepts. But argumentation is actually something that is a little bit more involved in the sense that it requires a different faculty of your mind. You're trying not to just turn your mind into a filing cabinet full of memorized things. That's not what argumentation's trying to do. Argumentation is more trying to turn your mind into a kind of a flow chart where if you start from one thing, it leads you to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing. That's a little bit more complicated of a structure to try to create in your mind. So it might be a little bit more difficult, but once you get the hang of it, I think that it's an invaluable tool. So with that in mind, that what we want to look at is argumentation, we can come to a specific chapter that has a specific topic, for instance, consequentialism, and then we can look at that chapter trying to figure out what the main arguments are. The lovely thing about this particular book is that it will lay out arguments for us explicitly. So the arguments look like this. So here we have the argument from injustice, and it's a famous argument against utilitarianism. There are lots of other arguments in this book. Many of them are explicit, like this. Others are implicit, meaning that they're not laid out in this nice formal structure. They can be found within the body paragraphs of the text. But what we also want to look for, besides for just looking for these arguments, we want to look for the analysis of these arguments. So usually right after the argument comes an analysis section. So we can see that right here, the next paragraph starts with, there are 4 replies that are especially important. So those replies are replies to the argument from injustice. And then the next paragraphs will discuss those replies. So the basic idea is that we have this argument. If we accept all of these premises, then we have this conclusion. But there are some replies that can be made to these premises. And if those replies succeed, then we can reject one of these premises, and it may be then that the argument fails. So we could go through the book memorizing the arguments and memorizing the replies, though I think that that would be probably the less effective way of doing it. The more effective way of doing it would be to start off with conclusions on the topics. So we can generate a conclusion. Maybe we want to argue for utilitarianism. Maybe we want to argue against utilitarianism. And then being able to, based on the definition of utilitarianism, develop some premises that are counterexamples to utilitarianism. So what would be a counterexample to utilitarianism? Well, utilitarianism is a theory that says that maximizing the well-being of the most number of persons is the best result, is the best system. If that's true, then what could be a counterexample to utilitarianism? Well, maybe if we prioritize justice, and justice doesn't result in the best well-being for the most people, then justice would be a counterexample. So we can set up an argument just by thinking about counterexamples, and then we have a good argument against utilitarianism. In order to generate replies to that argument, you would want to do a similar process with the premises. What could be a counterexample to these premises? And on and on. That can go for many layers, right? You can have premises, replies to the premises, replies to the replies to the premises, and the chain of arguments goes on like that. So for each of these 3 for each of these first chapters, we're going to want to think about the arguments in favor and against. So, what are arguments in favor of skepticism? What are arguments against it? Same with the good life. What are arguments for versions of the good life, and what are arguments against it? And we're going to want to, based on those arguments, try to determine which ones of these theories we find plausible and which ones we don't find plausible. Now, inevitably, because there are so many theories that we're proposing, some of them are going to contradict. So the point is not to say that all of these theories are correct. And actually, when you're reading philosophy in particular, and other things too, less so, but still, you don't want to go into the book memorizing it as if you're memorizing the truth. What you're actually trying to find is the definitions of theories that people find plausible, and comparing and contrasting them, and figuring out their strengths and weaknesses, and figuring out which ones you find to be stronger and weaker. So it would do no good, really. It would do no good to look at this as a list of moralities to memorize. It would do more good to look at this as the moralities that we are going to analyze and criticize. So moving on to the moral problems section, we're going to want to do a similar thing. We're going to want to look into the chapter, try to find the arguments. So going into the abortion chapter, here's the argument from humanity. And then we're going to want to analyze that argument. Now, this book does a great job of analyzing the argument for us, because as soon as the argument's over, we have various replies. So we have supports for the premises, and we have potential replies to those supports. So we have arguments for and against these arguments about abortion. And going through these, we can try to memorize them like before, but we also can try to reconstruct them in our mind by trying to think of counterexamples. So we can look at this particular argument. So this is an argument that is in favor of saying that abortion should be prohibited morally. So abortion is always, or perhaps almost always, immoral. How do we get there? We get there by saying if a fetus is an innocent human being, then abortion is always, or perhaps almost always, immoral, and the fetus is an innocent human being. So these would be support for the conclusion that's plausible, because we generally think that it's immoral to kill human beings. So it's taking advantage, this argument is taking advantage of our intuition that killing human beings is bad. And in order to find some credences for that, you can sort of just think what people would probably agree to. So would people probably agree that abortion is almost always immoral as long as it's the killing of a human being? Probably, because most people would say that murder is immoral. So how then, without memorizing, how then could we sort of reconstruct the counters? Well, we might think of counter examples to the premises. So we might try to think of a case where killing a human being is moral. Or we might try to think of a case where a fetus is not an innocent human being. Those would be counterexamples. And if we can think of plausible counterexamples, then we can start generating replies to this argument. So that's an example of how one might go about reading this book without even reading this book, essentially. You think of the conclusion you want to get to, you think of some intuitions that support it, and then you think of counterexamples to those intuitions that support the conclusion. If you do that, then really all you have to read in this book is just as little as you need to, and then you can start generating all of the arguments yourselves. And that would be even better, arguably, than reading the book if you could just spontaneously apply that process of argument generation. Then the book generates itself for you, essentially. So what does this mean from the perspective of strategically reading? Well, like I said, you would want to probably read the full first and second chapter and really absorb them by practicing the methodology of moral reasoning. Then you would want to read chapters 3 through 11, trying to find arguments in favor of or against each of the moral theories that's presented. Strategically read in search of those arguments for and against. And the same with the moral problems. Strategically read chapters 13 through 23, searching for those arguments for and against. So what are the arguments for abortion? What are the arguments against abortion? What are the arguments for the moral treatment of animals? What are the arguments against it? And so on. And what I would hope is that at some point during the readings, you would get used to the reasoning process enough that you could almost stop reading. You could simply absorb the main concept and then start reasoning about that concept without having to do the further readings. Of course, the reading's still good because it's sort of a shortcut. The reading is just somebody else who did those reasonings already for us, right? So in that sense, the reading is good because it's showcasing the process of the moral reasoning. But that shortcut does not mean that you should forego the process of the moral reasoning. And in fact, that's the main idea that supersedes all the other ideas, as I said, right? That taking away a mental faculty of moral reasoning that you can apply to anything, any theory that somebody hands to you. Not just these theories and not just these problems, but any theories and any problems, you can use that faculty of moral reasoning that you've developed and then apply it to those new ideas in new contexts and figure out what it is that you think about something. So we've gone over the two major ideas, the identifying of the core concepts, which is the memorization that I talked to you about, memorizing for vocabulary, with the idea that this would be important to following a conversation that is philosophically nuanced. You have to understand that vocabulary, so you have to have internalized it and memorized it. And then analyzing arguments, which is, I hope, something that you'll be able to do well by the end of the course, and that you'll feel very comfortable doing, to the point where you will be able to anticipate what the textbook author is going to argue even before he argues it. That's when you'll start knowing that you actually have absorbed this methodology of arguing. Is you'll be able to make the case in the textbook without even reading the textbook. You'll be able to predict what he's going to say. And hopefully you'll get there by the end of the course. But if you don't, it's your first philosophy course, so it's an introduction to these ideas. Or if it's not your first philosophy course, it's still early in the development of these ideas for you. So you should be able to keep on developing them and use them in life.